Welcome back to the Student Hub Live event for the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. We've had some really interesting sessions so far, and I know there's been an awful lot of discussion and debate on the hot desk. So let's take a quick trip to HJ and Damon and see what's been going on at home.
Well, a lot of talk about chickens, as expected. Unfortunately, I think we put off Sue and Janet of their chickens. I know Sue was going to have it for tonight, but perhaps not now. And Sarah thought it looked odd with having a dead chicken on the table. So, yes, it has... Well, we don't know if it's made its way to a fridge. I know there's 2 chickens running around here somewhere.
Yeah, there was a lot of concern about the chicken sitting on the table, to be honest.
But Russell and Chris have been talking as well about some interesting stuff about chickens being the subject of interesting taxes and laws in the United States. So how just one, small subject, just chickens, had such a big impact, even in like things like international relations. Has been interesting.
Yeah, and also the going back to the history of chicken production in the Second World War. So Chris was talking about the Wartime Farm programme that we did with the BBC a couple of years ago. And also about the nature of the changing nature of chickens. So John was talking about them being produced for their breast size, and it's been mentioned that there's meat being grown in labs now. So do they count as meat? Would vegetarians be able to eat that or not? And on the migration front, there's been a lot of discussion about how people move around. Can you be a migrant if you're moving just towns within a country? And so some people, so Sarah and Davin, talking about being military children moving around Germany, Hong Kong, that kind of area. So yeah, some interesting stuff.
But Davin has kept us on track because he thinks in regards to digital technology and health and well-being, there is a lot of potential, but he does have concerns about privacy and safety of digital data. So that'd be interesting to see how that links up as well.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, some wonderful, rich discussions there. So thank you for filling us in on that. This next session is from the School of Psychology, and we're going to look at digital mothering and relationships, which is a fascinating topic. As I said earlier, irrespective of whether you are a mother or not, so many of us are using social media, and here we look at how psychology is allowing us to investigate this particular phenomenon. So I'm joined by Rose and Lisa and Ginny, and we're going to talk about some various different projects that you're working on, and looking very much at how we're looking at digital parenting, both within the Open University and more externally as well. So Ginny, I wonder if first you could briefly tell us about your project. You're looking at perinatal anxiety, which is a very, very important topic. Parvati was talking earlier about making things a matter of concern, and this is one area that you really think should be more of a concern.
Absolutely. So the research I'm doing is actually born out of kind of practical experience, really. So I got back from maternity leave last year, and while I was on maternity leave, I was quite astounded by the amount of women that I was meeting who were really struggling in some way, shape or form with their mental health. Obviously quite a lot around anxiety and stress, about being a new mother, how to look after the baby, all of these things. But really had no idea that they were kind of suffering or what they were suffering from. We know a hell of a lot about postnatal depression. That seems to be where all of the research has been, and most people know about that in the public and stuff. But beyond that, in terms of mental well-being as a new mother or when you're pregnant, there's very little. So yeah, that's why I got really interested in it, really, and sort of just thought we need more information and more support, particularly around anxiety and stress. So that's what my research is doing, really. So in my previous life, before I was at the Open University, I was involved with basically building and evaluating an online, entirely automated program that kind of supports people with mild to moderate stress, anxiety and depression. And I thought that could be particularly useful for women, or something similar could be particularly useful for women who've just had babies and maybe won't be able to go out to a face-to-face appointment, for example, and get help that way. So it's kind of, how can we support women in a digital format around this period. So yeah, that's kind of what I'm looking at the moment.
We began the day today talking with Digital Humanities about the ways in which technology is helping us shape both what we can access and how people at home can access information, a lot more broadly than they used used to be able to. Can you tell us about some of the methods then that you're using in terms of how you're researching some of these, and in particular how things like anxiety might play out online in a sort of digital context?
Of course. So the initial research we did was actually to find out what's available out there already and how women are sort of talking about or looking for things to help them with anxiety. So we've done a website review of stuff that's already out there that gives information about perinatal anxiety, and we've tried to look for sort of things that can help support them through it, and there really isn't anything there other than the things like NetMums, Mumsnet, Baby Centre, you know, those really big kind of forums where people talk. So sort of doing a review and seeing that a lot of people are using these big kind of social forums to discuss their issues. We're also running focus groups though to see kind of what women are actually experiencing. So getting new mums in a room with their babies, which is challenging because trying to interview mums while they have their babies there who are crawling around the place is fun and games. That's what I'm doing this week. But trying to find out more about their experiences and also what they've done to kind of get support online, what they like, what they don't like, all of those sorts of things, what they search for, what they're needing help for. So we're actually asking them in these things as well. And we're finding like a kind of real mixed bag. As again, just through the focus groups, we're finding that NetMums and Mumsnet is coming up again and again, and Baby Centre and things like that. But people aren't necessarily finding them very helpful because it is full of basically anecdotal evidence or people, you know, presenting their way of mothering online, which isn't necessarily realistic, and you're just getting snapshots in these forums. And if you're anxious and you kind of go to a thread perhaps on NetMums and people are bombarding you with all sorts of different information about different ways of coping with things or different things they've done, that can actually quite be anxiety provoking. So that's actually not super helpful to have. You know, this website, which is initially set up for peer-to-peer support, actually might be causing some harm in that way.
I want to talk about that in a minute, but before we do, there's this interplay, I guess, between how people label things, how they articulate and externalise things online. You could quite happily go onto something like Mumsnet and say, is this eczema or is this this? There's this whole way we can try and diagnose certain things. But with mental health, it's quite a different area, and in particular with, you know, some of the changes to the way that the profession categorise things like anxiety as now separate from depression. How are women articulating some of these things? Are you looking therefore at symptoms or at, you know, behaviours? How are you sort of seeing what is actually happening when people may not be that articulate about how they're feeling?
It's a bit of both, and actually that's as in it's both the sort of words they're using and the behaviours that they're describing. But to be honest, it's all very new. So we're actually trying to work out what language they are using and what behaviours they are. What are the symptoms of perinatal anxiety? Are they different from what's in the DSM, which is the diagnostic manual that we use to diagnose like generalised anxiety disorder in the general public rather than in a perinatal specific, you know, population? Is perinatal anxiety, is the content of the worries and the behaviours, is that different to OCD, PTSD, GAD, you know, all the different sort of traditional anxiety, if you like, types? And it does look like they are experiencing things quite differently because the context is different. So of course you expect that to be the case. They are very focused on their ability as a mother, a lot of worries about what other people think, you know, how they think. One of the things that keep coming up is other people appear to be doing this so much better than I am. Social media probably doesn't help with that. No, I wonder, I mean, you two, we're going to talk, and we'll come back to your project as well, Ginny, because I think there's so many similarities here, and a key area of the focus of both your research, so you've worked together on things and separately also, is this sort of idea of the social construction and how one should parent and what good mothering looks like.
So we got into this a few years ago now, didn't we? And we first started looking at selfies, so how young women present themselves online through posting selfies to social media. But more recently, we've been looking at digital mothering. So one of the things that we have noticed is that mothers, particularly mothers, tend to post quite a lot of pictures of their families and children. But what was particularly interesting to us is that there seems to be a pattern around the way it's presented in kind of popular media and popular discourse. So there's a tendency to see that people who are doing a lot of posting of their children is kind of showing off and humble bragging. And it's been really nicely captured in this term called sharenting, which you might have heard of, which basically describes oversharing, patterns of oversharing of photos of your family and children. So what we started to do, so a kind of mini project last summer, was actually interviewing mothers who did post pictures of their children. And what we asked them to do is basically talk around some of their smartphone threads and show examples of that from their social media, and got them to talk about this experience of sharing and what it actually does for them and their families.
And it's interesting because, as Ginny was saying, you know, there's concern about the way what you're doing is being interpreted, the way it's being understood, and I think that the research indicates that they are being judged. I mean, when what they're doing is called humble bragging and is given terms like sharenting, you know, I think people are saying, oh, they're judging whether that's okay and it's not okay, whereas the mothers are telling a different kind of story about what they're trying to do in terms of telling stories about their families and trying to capture moments of their family life that they want to share. And they're also telling a story about what kind of mother they are, what kind of family they are, and they do want to show. I mean, is it bragging or is it pride to want to show people that you're actually, you know, quite proud of your children and that you're excited about their accomplishments and that maybe you feel a little bit implicated in their accomplishments because you're supporting them and you're encouraging them. So there's a lot of different things that mothers are doing online when they're posting those things. So it's interesting that idea that they're trying to tell the story about themselves, they're trying to tell the story about their family, but there's always this concern that they're being judged, that they're not quite, you know, getting there. You know, there's an interesting concept that Stephanie Taylor talks about, you know, this kind of troubled identities, you know, identities that it's really hard to hold on to. I mean, you can work really hard at them, but you never quite get them right, do you? And mothering is troubled in that kind of way quite a lot. You know, and there are a number of identities like that. So you try if you breastfeed, if you don't breastfeed, if you know, your house is tidy, if your house is messy, if you take them out 3 times a day, where do they sleep? You know, all that kind of thing. Can you get it right? And then, you know, that's the kind of Ginny's work about supporting women in that situation, so they're not feeling like they're in a constant state of failure, because this identity is a really difficult one to achieve.
Is there to some extent a sort of cyclical nature of this idea about what we think good mothering might look like, trying to collude with that idea or demonstrate it, and then being judged in turn and not meeting it? And, you know, is there something sort of interesting happening in that sort of social space?
I think that is definitely actually one of the things of how it plays out. So we had some mothers talking about the ideals of motherhood and how difficult it is actually to be this perfect mother, this perfect woman, this perfect professional, all these kind of different identities. And one, I'll give an example. So there was one interviewee, and she really struggled with this idea that a good mother is someone that sits down with their children and spends hours painting and kind of investing all this kind of emotional and practical kind of time and resource into their children. And this is something that she found really difficult, and it was the kind of relentlessness of these activities. So what she did was, it wasn't that she wasn't spending time with them, but she kind of did that kind of more intensive mothering with her daughter when she took her to her dance competitions. And this is the kind of information that she was posting up. And the kind of responses she was getting back is, oh, look, you're a really good mother, you're doing so well, what a great job you're doing. And actually that seemed to offset some of these kind of personal struggles that she was having, that actually she wasn't a good mother in lots of different ways, and she wasn't living up to these really intense ideals about what a good mother should be.
So to some extent then, are we sort of conceptualising people as having a problem if they are sort of, you know, either not or doing what they should or shouldn't be doing? What's that all about?
It's really complicated.
That's a good question. Yeah. And so what we're trying to do, that's quite a big question, is trying to focus on how that's playing out on social media, because it's a new phenomenon. So people are taking these kinds of, you know, kind of phenomena that exist outside and bringing it online. So in bringing it online, I think it shows up some of the kind of boundaries and the functions of it in particular kinds of ways. You know, so the research, you know, Lisa was mentioning we did research on selfies, young women and selfies, and those kinds of ways that young girls have historically been, in a sense, dismissed or trivialized, and their concerns and their interests. You know, that's come online very, very very seriously now, you see these kinds of postings of young women, and they're engaging with their friends, and they're telling about their lives, and they're, look at this outfit, 200 people have liked it, that's got to make you feel good, doesn't it? Yet when you read about it in the papers, or even in a lot of scientific papers, you get this kind of trivialization effect. They're so shallow, they're all they're worried about is how they look. Whereas, I mean, actually that's the format, isn't it? And what they're trying to do is probably more complex. But that issue isn't one of social media. That's an issue of our culture and the way we conceptualize young women. And we don't take them particularly serious in lots of different contexts. And I guess social media shows that up, and that's where we're kind of looking for it to understand how that's playing out. And also because we think it shouldn't play out, trying to see what we can do about addressing that issue.
Because I guess if they're, demonised as these narcissistic people doing certain things, and we're all aware that these are ways of acting out identities, and it's always a partial identity. But there was this one hoax, and I think this is an interesting sort of link to what you were saying before about the DSM and how we sort of categorise things, was this selfie-itis, which I thought was really interesting, because, we sort of talk about categorisation and then what counts, as people were saying at home, in relation to other topics. So it's very, very interesting in terms of how we can label things.
Yeah. Did you want to say something about selfie-itis?
Selfie-itis. I think it was an interesting kind of phenomenon, wasn't it? We've been looking at this recently in a lot of the work that we've been doing. So basically, there was a hoax on social media that suddenly, if you take so many selfies, you were diagnosable under the DSM, which Ginny's already talked about, and you'd have this phenomenon called selfie-itis. And it was a hoax, but what some psychologists did was to take the notion and try to kind of formalise that and find evidence for that through data. So that's what they did, and they devised a scale. They categorised people into different levels of selfie-itis, and then devised a scale in which to measure it. So I think it's interesting the way that some of our wider assumptions that are obviously quite problematic then play into the way that it becomes understood in psychology. So you just have to be really careful, I think, sometimes about the way that you read evidence. And I think that was one of the things that particular set of circumstances pointed to.
It illuminated some of the issues around the way we conceptualize things in psychology. I mean, it was taken quite seriously. The DSM people had to come online and say, no, this is not true. This is not in the DSM.
We've got narcissism here.
We don't need that. So that was interesting. It was taken quite seriously. But it does say something about the way we operationalize things in psychology, how sometimes we pathologize behaviors that maybe are natural responses to the context that people are given, or either if we're not pathologizing them, how do we manage them without trivializing them? So how do we take these behaviors seriously? Is it a serious issue that some young girls or even young men are spending all their day taking pictures of themselves? Is that something we want to address? But do we need to pathologize it to do that? How we work with those situations, and I think that's a real challenge for psychology, and one that we've been struggling with for a long time.
Yeah, and to some extent, it's very necessary in your area, because you're looking to say, is this phenomenon actually there? And by pathologising something, you're offering treatment, you're offering some sort of intervention, which I guess is some of the point about categorising and diagnosing things in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we need to know what things are, we need to know what symptoms are, if we need to treat it. I think one thing that needs to be really clear in terms of pathologising is that it's really, at what point does it become a pathology, or what point does it become a clinical illness or whatever? And I think it has to be when it starts interfering with your day-to-day life in some negative way. And I think that's the really important distinction, I think most people would say with perinatal anxiety, which is obviously very different, it's really unpleasant. And most people would like help with it. So I think in that, instance, it is probably a pathology of some description, although it's a very normal reaction to the situation people are in as well. So it's it's a bit of both in that respect with that one. So I think it's quite tricky, but there are things that we can do to help support people who are feeling anxious or stressed during pregnancy or during the first year of being a mother. So if we can help and people want the help.
Because you're working on an app, aren't you?
Well, that's the idea. So we're in the very initial stages at the moment. So we're kind of scoping out the need for it and what that might look like. So we're working with mothers, with the focus groups, to work out what they want and what we can build to help them, basically. But it will be all evidence-based, so that's the point, really. So instead of something like Mumsnet or everything which is peer-to-peer and anecdotal and all of that stuff, we want to build something that is wanted by the mums, but is heavily based on non-biased and evidence-based information, for both information for mums about perinatal anxiety, but also to provide potential treatment and support avenues. So that's the end goal. Just in the very initial stages at the moment, but that's hopefully we'll get there in the next kind of year or so.
And I wonder if we can talk then with you, Lisa and Rose, about you're doing very important work in terms of figuring out how emotions play out, and those social support roles are obviously really necessary for people to be doing some of these behaviours in the first place. So I guess my question then to end with is where's the value? How is this sort of contributing to mental health, I guess, in another sort of context, and how people seek support in these digital environments, and how that supports these notions of good mothering that are changing, as you say, quite quickly over time?
I think with the mothering research that we've done, the research that we've done so far, as you pointed out, has flagged up some emotional work that mothers do online, and what we've kind of found is that work has actually been quite important in terms of building relationships in that kind of dispersed network online, and that has real implications for offline. But what we're kind of shifting on, and what our evidence so far pushes us towards, is looking at actually digital relationships between family members. So what we're looking at more so now is how as those children grow older in those photos, what are their reactions going to be like when mum or dad post pictures of them online? So what we're really trying to tease out is those kind of power dynamics actually between parents and children, children and parents, and wider family networks, because that actually does have implications for children's well-being as well as actually parents' well-being too.
Lovely. Well, it's been such a fantastic discussion. Rose, is there anything you'd like to end with in terms of maybe something around how psychology is using these various things to make sense of some of the things that, don't necessarily make sense in the first place? Some of the methods, some of the ideas that you're all using are really trying to, draw something out there that isn't evident.
Well, I think I'm not trying to just sell psychology, but I think one of the real strengths of psychology and the way we're working, we're taking very different perspectives or approaches, but we're coming together in certain places around that research, around how we establish knowledge, around how we make sense of different phenomena in the world. So, Ginny's talking about the app, but also doing focus groups and be doing surveys. We've used visual methods, we've used Q methodology, we've used surveys as well, story completion, we've used all kinds of things, trying to get at, and I think this is the thing, it's people's experience, isn't it? When Ginny's talking about the women who are suffering with perinatal anxiety, it's the experience of distress. That's what we want to be addressing. That's what we want to be, improving. And women's distress with parenting, and when they struggle, we want to be able to help them.
And we can see how it's been something meaningful in some sort of sense to all of you, but also it's meaningful on a global scale, and you're connecting with colleagues internationally at other universities on the digital mothering platform. Can you briefly just tell us what that's all about?
Want to say something about that?
Yeah, so basically, as I mentioned, we ran this study last summer, and then based on that, because I think the findings were quite novel, and it tapped into a lot of different areas for scholars that are working around mothering. So we set up the digital mothering group. So we're working with colleagues across the country, and they've all got slightly different backgrounds that they bring to it. So that's partly what's facilitated our shift from mothering to families. It's been quite an interesting project.
Yeah.
The problem with psychology, of course, is that everything has a context and a context and a context. So, but presents very different ways of looking at things, and a very important issue. Well, thank you very much, Ginny, Rose and Lisa, for coming along. I'd like to take a quick trip to the hot desk and see what HJ and Jamin have been doing.
There's some really good discussion going on. There's Janet has said maybe we need to give mothers a bit of slack online. There's been some discussion about online peer-to-peer support, and Davin is saying that he's working on an online system at the moment as part of his MSc. Some really good stuff.
We also had. I also like to talk about a lot about online privacy, and Davin's been looking into that. He's done a EMA on the subject, which is really interesting about all the new powers and laws that have come into effect. And leading on from what you were saying, we are talking as well about the anxiety we have about what we post online. Will I be judged for it? How will other people view me? And all the problems that come from that. So it's really interesting discussion. And all throughout the day, we've had great discussions on lots of different projects and things that are going on at the university. So I'd just like to remind everyone, on our website there's a resources page. I'll post it in the box for everyone, and it's got links to all the interesting things that we've been talking about, and lots of stuff for us to follow up on as well.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, HJ and Damien. You've done a fantastic job, and thank you everyone at home who's been contributing to the conversation also. That, unfortunately, is all we have time for today. So I'd like to thank colleagues from Arts and Cultures, History, Religious Studies, Sociology, Social Policy and Criminology, and we've heard from Politics, Philosophy, Economics, Development and Geography, and finally from Psychology. If you've missed some of these sessions today, you can watch them on the catch-up, which will be available on the Student Hub Live website. On that website also there's a feedback form. We'd love to know what you thought of the show, and if you've got any suggestions for things we might do in future, we would love to hear from you. Either feedback there on the Student Hub Live website, or you can send us an email, studenthub@open.ac.uk. Before we go, we'd love it if you could give us 3 words to describe your experience today in our Wordle. So just put up to 3 things, but if you can't think of 3, put a full stop in the empty box so that we can submit your answer. We've been doing lots of other things at the Student Hub Live that I'd just like to draw your attention to as well. We've been having an EMA session, which we did last night, and there's another one next week. So for those of you with EMAs to do, come along and pick up some study skills. It's all non-modular, but it's a great way to think about various things that you can do to plan your time, answer and unpack that question and get a strategy that's going to work for you. We also have an exam focus in which psychology will also be contributing. So we've got some online sessions in Adobe Connect, and then we've also got a broadcast session here in the studio. And one of the things we're talking about, in addition to diet, sleep and exercise, is memory and how that can help you when revising for exams. So do join us for that on the 25th of May. Also on the 25th of May, we have a Brexit event. So we'll be hearing from colleagues from the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences about Brexit and what's going to be happening in the future, and some reflections on the past as well. That'll be a fascinating show. And then we're going to do a showcase in June as well from the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, where we'll be looking at the new modules that are in store for you this September. So do join us for that on the 14th of June. But stay in touch, subscribe to our YouTube channel so that you can see the trailers of when the next events are, and of course catch up about all of that in the website. Thank you all very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the event, and we hope to see you at another event very soon. Bye for now.